My father shoved me backward into the stone fountain at my sister's wedding and screamed that I was a worthless embarrassment for showing up alone. 200 guests laughed as I gasped for air in the freezing water my silk dress ruined. My sister Brittany smirked and told me I finally looked like the trash I was. I wiped the water from my eyes and smiled because they had no idea what was coming. 10 minutes later, a private helicopter would land on the golf course, and out would step my husband Sebastian Knight, the billionaire shipping magnate. And the best part was that he was not just there to pick me up. He was there to reveal that I was the actual owner of the mansion they were standing in. My name is Audrey, and at 33 years old, I am an art appraiser who has spent a decade being the black sheep of a family that worships money but has none left. While my younger sister Brittany was treated like a princess, I was the invisible servant, always criticized for being too quiet, too studious, and not social enough to marry rich. They thought I was working a dead-end job at a library, unaware that I was managing private art portfolios for the wealthiest families in America. When the invitation to Brittany's wedding in Newport, Rhode Island arrived, I knew it was a trap. They did not want me there for love. They wanted me there to compare my failure to her success. But I went anyway, armed with a secret that would burn their house of cards to the ground. Before I continue this story of sweet revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile at people who treated you like dirt, knowing you were already winning the war. The air in Newport was crisp that afternoon, carrying the scent of salt and old money. I walked through the wrought iron gates of the Breakers, one of the most exclusive venues on the coast. I was wearing a simple navy blue silk dress. It had no logos, so to my family it probably looked cheap. In reality, it was a bespoke piece from a quiet atelier in Milan, costing more than Brittany's entire tacky lace wedding gown. I had barely taken 10 steps onto the manicured lawn when I saw him. My father, Richard. He was already red in the face, likely from the whiskey he had been drinking since noon, to calm his nerves about the massive debt he was hiding. He spotted me and marched over, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel path. There was no hug, no hello. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin with bruising force. "Where is he?" Richard hissed, his breath smelling of alcohol and desperation. "You told your mother you might bring someone." "I do not see anyone, Audrey. Did you lie to us again?" I pulled my arm away, keeping my voice calm. "My husband is on his way, Dad. He had a meeting." Husband Richard let out a bark of cruel laughter that drew the attention of the nearby guests. "You mean some loser you picked up at a bar to pretend for the day? Or did he realize what a bore you are and dump you at the curb?" "Look around you, Audrey. This is a high society event. Brittany is marrying a hedge fund manager. We have senators here, and you show up alone looking like a charity case." I straightened my back. "I am not alone, Dad. And frankly, I do not care what your guests think." That was the wrong thing to say. Richard's eyes bulged. He felt his authority slipping, and like all weak men, he resorted to physical intimidation. We were standing right next to the antique marble fountain, the centerpiece of the garden. "You do not care, you ungrateful little brat," he screamed, losing all composure. "You are ruining the aesthetic. If you are going to look like a drowned rat, you might as well be one." He shoved me. It was not a stumble or an accident. He placed both hands on my shoulders and pushed with all his weight. I lost my balance, my heels slipping on the wet stone. Time seemed to slow down as I fell backward. The cold water hit me like a shockwave, completely submerging me. I thrashed for a moment, finding my footing on the slippery bottom, and surfaced gasping for air. The live jazz band stopped playing. A silence heavier than the water descended on the garden. I stood there, waist deep in the fountain water dripping from my hair and ruining the silk dress. I looked up to see my father standing over me, panting, a look of twisted satisfaction on his face. Behind him, the guests were not helping. They were covering their mouths to hide their giggles. Phones were already out recording the humiliation. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the pure, crystalline realization that any shred of love I had left for this man had just died in that water. The water in the fountain was not just cold. It was shocking, a physical assault that took the breath right out of my lungs. I scrambled for a foothold on the slick mossy bottom, my expensive silk dress weighing me down like an anchor. As I broke the surface, gasping and shivering, I instinctively reached out a hand expecting someone, anyone, to help me up. That was my mistake. I had forgotten who these people were. Instead of concerned gasps, a roar of laughter erupted from the lawn. It was not a nervous titter. It was full-throated, malicious amusement. I wiped the stinging water from my eyes and saw a sea of smartphones pointed directly at me. The flashes went off like strobe lights. These were supposed to be the elite of Newport, the pillars of society, yet they looked like vultures circling a carcass. A woman in a red Valentino gown, someone I had known since childhood, was actually live-streaming my humiliation, narrating to her followers how the bride's loser sister had crashed the party. My father stood back, crossing his arms, with a satisfied smirk, watching the spectacle he had created. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. Then came the sharp clicking of heels against the stone path. My sister Brittany stopped right at the edge of the fountain. She looked immaculate in her $50,000 lace gown, her makeup flawless, standing in stark contrast to my dripping, shivering form. She did not offer a hand. She did not ask if I was hurt. She just took a sip of her champagne and looked down at me with pure disgust. "You look like a drowned rat," she said, her voice loud enough for the front row to hear. "Seriously, Audrey, could you be any more desperate for attention? Do not dare step out of there and drip on the patio. That is imported Italian marble, and if you stain it, I will bill you for the replacement, although we both know you cannot afford it." The laughter swelled again. I felt a sharp pain in my shin where I had hit the fountain nozzle, but the emotional blow was worse. Before I could retort, my mother, Patricia, bustled through the crowd. For a split second, a foolish part of me thought she was coming to save me. Instead, she snatched a dirty, grease-stained rag from a passing waiter's tray and threw it at my face. It slapped against my wet skin, smelling of stale beer and cocktail sauce. "Wipe your face," she hissed, her eyes darting around nervously to see if the groom's wealthy family was watching. "You are a disaster. Get out of that water and go stand by the service entrance at the back gate. Do not let Jamal's parents see you like this. We told them you were a librarian, not a swamp monster. Now move before security drags you out." I clutched the dirty rag, my knuckles turning white. They wanted me to hide. They wanted me to be ashamed. But as I looked at their cruel faces, something inside me snapped. I was not going to the back gate. I did not go to the back gate. Instead, I marched straight into the opulent ladies' lounge near the ballroom entrance. The room was empty, lined with gold-framed mirrors and smelling of expensive lilies. I locked myself in the furthest stall just as the heavy oak door swung open. I held my breath, pressing my back against the marble wall as water pooled around my ankles, ruining my shoes. Two familiar voices filled the room. It was my mother and Brittany. I could hear the aggressive rustling of silk as my mother likely adjusted Brittany's veil. "Stop crying," Patricia hissed, her voice sharp and panicked. "You are ruining your mascara. Do you have any idea how much the makeup artist cost? We cannot afford a touch-up." "It is not the makeup, Mom." Brittany sobbed, her voice trembling. "I am scared. Jamal has been acting weird about the money. What if he finds out? Finds out what? That we are drowning." Patricia lowered her voice, but in the echoing bathroom I heard every word clearly. "Listen to me carefully, Brittany. The bank called your father again this morning. The foreclosure notice on the Hamptons house is already printed. We owe $2 million. If this wedding does not happen, if you do not get Jamal to sign those joint account papers by Monday morning, we lose everything. We will be on the street." My heart hammered against my ribs. $2 million. My parents, who acted like royalty, were essentially bankrupt. They were selling their favorite daughter to a fraudster just to keep their mansion. "But what about Audrey?" Brittany sniffled. "She saw the foreclosure letter on the counter last Christmas. What if she tells Jamal?" Patricia let out a cruel, dismissive laugh that made my blood boil. "Audrey. Do not make me laugh. Who would listen to her? She is a failure. A 33-year-old librarian living in a shoebox apartment. She has absolutely no value to this family because she has no assets and no connections. She is trash, Brittany. Ignore her. Just focus on Jamal and his checkbook. Once you are married, his money becomes our money. Now fix your face and get out there." The door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the silence. I stood there for a moment, processing the revelation. They did not just hate me. They viewed me as a commodity that had failed to yield a return. To them, I was useless because I could not pay their debts. I unlocked the stall door and stepped out to the mirror. My dress was still damp, but my eyes were dry. I looked at my reflection and smiled. They thought I was a broke librarian. They had no idea that the real estate firm initiating their foreclosure was a subsidiary of my husband's company. And they had no idea that I was the one who had given the final approval to seize their assets. I wrung out the hem of my dress, fixed my hair, and walked back out to the party. I was not leaving. I was going to watch them burn. I stepped out of the sanctuary of the ladies' lounge and back into the corridor, intending to return to the garden, but my path was blocked by a figure leaning casually against the silk wallpaper. It was Kyle. Of course it was Kyle. My college ex-boyfriend, and now apparently the best man for Jamal. He was swirling a glass of amber whiskey, looking impeccable in a tuxedo that I knew he had rented, though he acted like he owned the building. Kyle had always been a man who measured his self-worth by the failure of others. Seeing me wet, humiliated, and alone was probably the highlight of his day. He pushed off the wall and stood in front of me, forcing me to stop. He looked me up and down with a sneer that made my skin crawl. "I heard the rumor, but I did not want to believe it," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Audrey, the librarian, stamping books for minimum wage while your little sister marries into a hedge fund dynasty. It is tragic, really. You used to be the pretty one. Now look at you. You are a wet mess at the event of the season." I tried to step around him, but he sidestepped to block me again. "Excuse me, Kyle," I said coldly. "I have a wedding to attend." "Do you really, though?" He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You are not a guest, Audrey. You are the entertainment. Everyone out there is taking bets on how long until you run away crying. But I am a generous guy. I feel bad for you." He took a step closer, invading my personal space. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore to mask the scent of his mediocrity. "Tell you what," he whispered, leaning down. "Jamal owes me a favor. If you get on your knees right now and ask nicely, I could probably get you a position on the night cleaning crew at his firm. At least then you would be around money even if you never touch it. It is probably the best offer you will get all year." The old Audrey, the one who sought validation from this toxic circle, might have slapped him or burst into tears. But that Audrey died the moment she hit the water in the fountain. I looked at Kyle, really looked at him, and saw him for what he was. A small, insecure man clinging to the coattails of a fraud. I did not back down. Instead, I stepped into his space, forcing him to lean back slightly. "Careful, Kyle," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "You are so busy looking down on me that you forgot to look at where you are standing. You are playing a game you do not understand. There are some people you should not poke, and right now you are dancing on a landmine. Keep talking, and I promise you the explosion will leave you with nothing." Kyle blinked, the smirk faltering for a second. He had never heard me speak like that. He opened his mouth to retort, but I pushed past him, my shoulder checking his hard enough to make his whiskey splash onto his rented sleeve. I walked back toward the garden, ready for the next round. The time for hiding was over. The adrenaline from confronting Kyle was still coursing through my veins as I walked back into the main reception tent. It was a masterpiece of white orchids and gold cutlery, a perfect facade for a rotten family. The air smelled of expensive perfume and hypocrisy. I walked straight to table 1, the seat of honor for immediate family, located right next to the dance floor. My father was already there, laughing loudly with a glass of scotch in his hand. My mother was nervously fixing her pearls. I scanned the place settings. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, Jamal. Even Kyle had a seat reserved with calligraphy on thick cardstock. But the spot between my mother and my aunt was empty. There was no chair, no plate, no name card. It was as if I did not exist. Before I could ask where my seat was, a wedding coordinator with a clipboard and a headset materialized in front of me. He looked at my damp dress with a sneer that mirrored my sister's. He blocked my path to the table, crossing his arms over his chest. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice dripping with faux politeness. "This area is reserved for VIP guests and the wedding party only. We have made other arrangements for you." He pointed a manicured finger toward the far, dark corner of the tent, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. There, a small, wobbly plastic table sat in the shadows. It was surrounded by high chairs and screaming toddlers throwing cake. "Table 19, he said, checking his clipboard as if this was standard procedure. "The bride felt you would be more comfortable there away from the official photographs. It is the children's table. We thought you would fit right in since you are currently acting like a child by showing up wet. Please move along, the speeches are about to start." The audacity took my breath away. They wanted to hide me in the dark with the toddlers while they toasted their fraudulent success with champagne. I looked at the coordinator, then at my parents, who were studiously ignoring me, pretending to be fascinated by the floral centerpiece. They were letting this happen. They sanctioned this final humiliation. I did not walk to the kitchen. I did not cry. Instead, I walked over to the adjacent table where a few chairs were empty. I grabbed a heavy gold chair by its backrest. The coordinator stepped in my path, panic flashing in his eyes. "Miss, you cannot do that," he hissed. "I have my orders from the bride. And I have a birth certificate that says I am the sister of the bride." I replied, my voice loud enough to carry over the background music. I dragged the heavy chair across the wooden floor. The screeching sound of the chair legs against the wood was excruciatingly loud, silencing the entire front row of guests. I slammed the chair down into the tight space between my mother and my aunt, forcing them to scoot over. I sat down, crossed my legs, and smoothed my damp skirt with deliberate slowness. I looked up at the stunned coordinator and then at my horrified mother. "I am the bride's sister," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. "I sit here. Now bring me a clean glass of champagne, or I will grab the microphone and start making a speech about why the groom's credit card was declined for the floral deposit yesterday. Do not test me." The speeches concluded, and the atmosphere shifted from celebration to a grotesque display of wealth. It was time for the gift exchange, a tradition my family had twisted into a competition of net worth. Jamal grabbed the microphone, loosening his tie as if he had just closed a billion-dollar deal on Wall Street. He signaled to the valet, who drove a gleaming silver Porsche 911 onto the lawn, the engine roaring aggressively. The guests gasped in unison. Jamal held up a key fob with a smug grin that made my stomach turn. "For my beautiful bride," he announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "A 2025 Porsche GT3. Because a queen deserves a chariot." Brittany shrieked, covering her mouth with manicured hands, acting as if she had not picked out the car herself 2 weeks ago. The crowd erupted into applause, whispering about how lucky she was to land a man with such deep pockets. I took a sip of my lukewarm water and watched them. They saw a supercar. I saw a desperate lease agreement. I knew for a fact that Jamal did not have the credit score to buy that car outright. It was a weekend rental, likely charged to a corporate card that was about to be declined. But to everyone else, he was the golden goose, the financial savior who had elevated our family to royalty. Then it was my parents' turn. My father, Richard, stepped up with a black velvet box, looking every bit the proud patriarch. He opened it to reveal a blindingly large diamond necklace and earring set. "From your mother and me," he said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. "A knight deserves diamonds. This set is worth $50,000, but your happiness is priceless." The guests ooh and ah, dazzled by the sparkle. My mother wiped a tear, looking around to ensure everyone saw her generosity. From my seat at the edge of the VIP table, I squinted at the stones. I am an appraiser. I know the fire of a real diamond versus the dull refraction of a stimulant. Those stones were high-grade cubic zirconia, probably purchased on a predatory installment plan with a high interest rate. They were mortgaging their future to buy fake status for a daughter who married a fraud. The irony was suffocating. Here, they were celebrating a union built on lies, exchanging rented cars and financed jewelry, while treating me, the only person with actual liquid assets, like a pariah. A woman at the next table leaned over to her friend and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "Look at the sister. She is just sitting there with nothing. It must be so hard to watch your sibling succeed when you have failed so badly." I did not flinch. I did not correct her. I simply smoothed the napkin on my lap and waited. Their house of cards was tall and glittering, but the wind was picking up, and I was about to be the storm. Duide, la phân đoán bài mon qua vô giá trị, được viết tiếp theo, mất trin tuân thủ đúng yêu cầu. Tiếng Anh giống văn xúc tích không tiêu đề, không dấu bà chạm tối ưu cho giọng đọc AI. The applause for the cubic zirconia finally faded. It was my turn. I stood up from my stolen seat, clutching a small rectangular package wrapped in plain brown butcher paper. It looked pathetic next to the velvet jewelry boxes and the car keys, but I walked toward the head table with my head held high. The room went silent, anticipation hanging thick in the air. They were expecting a toaster, or perhaps nothing at all. I could feel my mother's gaze burning into my back, silently begging me to sit down and stop embarrassing them. I approached the groom. I did not smile. I simply placed the package gently on the white tablecloth in front of Jamal. He looked at the brown paper like it was a dead rodent. With a theatrical roll of his eyes meant to entertain the crowd, he tore the paper open. He revealed a book. It was not shiny. The cover was a faded deep blue, and the edges were slightly worn with age. Jamal stared at it for a second, blinked, and then burst into a laugh that echoed through the microphone system. He held the book up by one corner, dangling it in the air for the 200 guests to see, treating it like contaminated waste. "What is this?" Jamal boomed, his voice cracking with amusement. "A book. Seriously, Audrey, you cannot be serious. We are at $1 million wedding. We are exchanging Porsches and diamonds, and you bring me used paper." He turned to the crowd, shrugging his shoulders. "I guess this is what happens when your sister is a librarian, folks. She brings you something she probably stole from the return bin. Did you pull this out of a dumpster on your way here, Audrey? Because it smells like old attic. This is insulting. Someone get this trash off my table before it infects the champagne." He tossed the book carelessly onto the table. It slid across the silk cloth and stopped dangerously close to a slice of wedding cake. The guests roared with laughter. Brittany covered her face, shaking her head in mock embarrassment, playing the victim of my poverty. I stared at the book. They saw a dirty old novel. They saw trash. What they did not see, because they were uneducated and blinded by new money, arrogance, was that this was a pristine first edition of The Great Gatsby from 1925. It had the original dust jacket fully intact, a rarity that made it the holy grail of collectors. I had won it at an exclusive estate sale in London. Its current market appraisal was $300,000. It was worth more than Jamal's leased car and my parents' fake jewelry combined. It was a ticket out of debt lying right there next to the cake. But looking at their sneering faces, I realized something important. They did not deserve to know its worth. They did not deserve to be saved. I looked Jamal dead in the eye. "You might want to be careful with that, Jamal," I said calmly, though my voice was lost under the laughter. "Books can be heavy, especially when they carry the weight of everything you do not know." He just waved his hand, dismissing me like a servant. "Go sit down, Audrey. You have done enough damage. Next time, just bring a card. It is cheaper." I turned around and walked back to my seat. I let them laugh. I let them think I was the poor relation. Because in about 20 minutes that book was going back in my bag, and they were going to be left with nothing but their ignorance. The laughter at the head table did not die down naturally. It was silenced by the sharp clicking of heels on the parquet floor. Odette, Jamal's mother, emerged from the crowd like a shark surfacing in shallow water. She was a formidable woman who wore her ambition like armor, draped in a gold sequined gown that was far too tight and far too bright for an afternoon garden wedding. She did not look amused by her son's jokes. She looked annoyed that the schedule was being interrupted by someone she considered a peasant. Odette marched up to the table where the book lay next to the wedding cake. She looked at me with eyes that were cold, hard flint. To her, I was not just a poor relation. I was a stain on the perfect picture she was trying to paint for the senators and investors in the audience. She reached out and picked up the vintage book with 2 fingers, her long rhinestone-encrusted acrylic nails clicking against the delicate dust jacket. She held it away from her body as if it were a soiled diaper. "You have some nerve," Odette said, her voice low and menacing, projecting a terrifying authority that silenced even my father. "We invite you here out of pity. We feed you. We tolerate your wet clothes and your sullen attitude. And this is how you repay us, by mocking my son on his coronation day." She did not wait for an answer. With a sneer of absolute disgust, she flung the book onto the ground. It landed in the dirt with a dull thud dangerously close to a puddle of melted ice from a champagne bucket. "We do not need your paper trash," Odette spat, towering over me. "My son buys libraries, he does not read used books. We are people of substance, Audrey. We deal in assets in diamonds and futures. Take your garbage and get out of my sight before I have security throw you out with it. You are insulting the family name." The guests gasped, but nobody moved. My mother looked down at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes. My father poured himself another drink. They were letting this woman destroy my gift, unaware that she was throwing away the only thing that could have paid off their mortgage. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I simply walked over to where the book lay in the grass. I knelt down, ignoring the mud staining my knees, and picked it up with the reverence it deserved. I brushed a blade of grass off the cover and checked the spine. It was unharmed. I stood up and looked Odette dead in the eye. She expected me to cry. Instead, I looked at her with pity. "You are right, Odette," I said, my voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension. "You do deal in futures, but you are very bad at predicting them. You just threw away the only thing at this entire wedding that has any real value. That wasn't just a book, it was your lifeline, and you just severed it." Odette laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Get out of my face, you delusional girl." I placed the book carefully into my tote bag. I had offered them a parachute and they had set it on fire. Now all I had to do was step back and watch them fall. The awkward tension from the book incident was broken by Mrs. Sterling, an elderly woman draped in pearls who happened to be one of the biggest investors in Jamal's hedge fund. She peered at me over the rim of her champagne flute, her eyes narrowing with genuine curiosity. Perhaps she noticed the quality of my silk dress, or the way I held myself, which did not match the description of the beggar my family had painted. "So tell us, Audrey," Mrs. Sterling asked, her voice cutting through the chatter. "We have heard so much about Brittany's interior design business, and Jamal's financial wizardry. But what is it that you do for a living?" I opened my mouth to answer. I was about to tell her that I was currently the head of acquisitions for the Knight Art Foundation, and that I had just brokered the sale of a $20 million Van Gogh the previous week, but I never got the chance. My father, Richard, practically leaped across the table to cut me off, his face flushing a deep panic-induced crimson. "She does nothing," Richard blurted out, spilling a bit of his scotch on the white tablecloth. "Audrey is currently finding herself," which is a polite way of saying she is unemployed and living off the kindness of others. "You know how this generation is. They expect everything to be handed to them without lifting a finger." He glared at me with bulging eyes, a silent warning to keep my mouth shut. He needed me to be the failure. If I was successful, his narrative of the benevolent father supporting a wayward daughter would collapse. I saw my mother nod in agreement, sipping her drink nervously. "Yes, it is quite tragic," Patricia added, playing the long-suffering martyr. "We have tried to encourage her to get a real job, perhaps in retail or food service, but Audrey simply lacks the drive that Brittany has. We just pray she doesn't end up on the street." Jamal, sensing an opportunity to reclaim his alpha status after the book debacle, leaned back in his chair and swirled his wine. He looked at me with a predator's grin. "Actually, Dad, that gives me a great idea," Jamal said, his voice loud and booming. "My firm just acquired a new property in the Hamptons with a massive pool. Our maintenance guy just quit. It is minimum wage, Audrey, but I can pull some strings and get you an interview. You would be scrubbing algae and skimming dead bugs, but it is honest work. I will even throw in a bonus if you keep the water crystal clear from my pool parties." The table erupted. The groomsmen slapped the table, howling with laughter. Brittany giggled behind her hand, looking at me with pity. Even Mrs. Sterling chuckled, shaking her head as if I were a hopeless charity case. They looked at me and saw a pool cleaner, a servant. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked at Jamal, visualizing the bankruptcy filings I had seen on my husband's desk that morning. I visualized the fact that he didn't own a property in the Hamptons, he was renting a condo and was 2 months behind on payments. That is a very generous offer, Jamal, I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a razor blade. I will keep it in mind. Although considering your financial situation, I would demand payment up front. Cash only. I hear your checks have a habit of bouncing. The laughter faltered for a second, but Jamal waved it off, too arrogant to realize I wasn't joking. He had no idea that the only person at this table capable of employing him was the woman he just offered a mop to. The laughter at the pool boy joke was still ringing in the air when I decided to drop the nuclear bomb. I picked up my napkin, dabbed my mouth gently, and looked at Jamal with the kind of pity one reserves for a terminal patient who does not know they are dying. The guests were still smiling, expecting another retort from the poor sister, but the heir was about to leave the room. That is an interesting offer, Jamal, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the tent, without a hint of tremor. But before I accept a position at Titan Capital, I have a few due diligence questions, specifically regarding the subpoena you received from the Securities and Exchange Commission last Tuesday. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if I had fired a gun into the ceiling. The smile vanished from Jamal's face so quickly it was almost violent. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, and the crystal champagne flute in his hand shook visibly, spilling liquid onto his cuff. My father stopped chewing. My mother froze. I continued, my voice calm and clinical, reciting facts I had memorized from the dossier on my husband's desk. I read the preliminary report in the Financial Times this morning. Titan Capital posted a 40% loss last month. That is 40% of your investors' money gone in 30 days. And the SEC is investigating irregularities in your liquidity. Some are calling it a miscalculation. Others are using the word embezzlement. So tell me, Jamal, are you hiring a pool boy because you need the help, or because you need a way to launder the remaining cash before the feds freeze your accounts? Jamal slammed his fist onto the table. The plates rattled, and a vase of white roses toppled over, sending water cascading across the tablecloth. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a loud crash. His face was no longer gray. It was purple with rage. "Shut up!" he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "Shut your mouth, you jealous little witch! That is a lie. It is all lies. You are just trying to ruin my reputation because you are bitter that I am rich, and you are nothing." He looked around at the guests, his eyes wide and manic. "Do not listen to her. She is mentally unstable. She has always been jealous of Brittany. My fund is performing better than ever. We are breaking records." "It is not a lie if it is in the public record, Jamal," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "And judging by the sweat on your forehead, I think we both know exactly where that missing money went. Did it go into this wedding? Or perhaps into the lease on that Porsche outside?" Jamal looked like he was about to stroke out. He realized he could not win this argument with words because I had the truth, and the truth was a weapon he was not equipped to fight. He pointed a shaking finger at the entrance of the tent. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Get in here! Get this woman out of my wedding! She is trespassing! She is harassing the groom! Drag her out by her hair if you have to, just get her out of my sight!" The guests gasped as two large men in black uniforms started marching toward me from the perimeter. My mother put her head in her hands. My father looked away. But I did not move. I did not flinch. I just watched Jamal unravel, knowing that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The two security guards did not ask me to leave. They did not offer an arm or point toward the exit. They lunged at me like bouncers breaking up a bar fight, eager to flex their authority on a woman they perceived as defenseless. One of them, a man with a thick neck and breath that smelled of stale tobacco, grabbed my right arm. His grip was not firm. It was punishing. He dug his fingers into the soft flesh of my bicep, twisting my arm behind my back with a force that sent a searing bolt of pain shooting up to my shoulder. I gasped the air leaving my lungs, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a scream. The second guard grabbed my left wrist, yanking me forward so hard that I stumbled in my high heels. My silk dress, which had just started to dry, was now being crumpled and pulled taut against my body as they manhandled me. "Let me go," I hissed, planting my feet on the grass to resist their momentum. "You have no right to touch me. This is assault. Shut up, lady." The first guard grunted, tightening his grip until I felt my shoulder joint pop. The groom said, "Get out so you are getting out. Do not make us drag you." I looked around the tent searching for a shred of humanity. My father was pouring himself another scotch, his hand shaking slightly, but he did not look up. My mother was aggressively adjusting a flower arrangement, pretending that her daughter was not being physically attacked 10 feet away. Brittany was the only one watching. She stood next to Jamal sipping her champagne, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. She looked like a queen watching an execution. The guests were murmuring, some looking uncomfortable, but most just watching the spectacle with morbid curiosity. The guards shoved me toward the exit, their movements rough and uncoordinated. I stumbled again, my ankle twisting painfully. "You are making a mistake," I said, my voice low and dangerous, fighting through the pain in my shoulder. "I am giving you one chance to unhand me. If you drag me out of here, you will lose your licenses, you will lose your jobs, and you will be facing a lawsuit that will bankrupt you." The guards laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "Listen to her," the second guard mocked. "She thinks she is somebody. Keep walking, sweetheart. The only thing you are going to sue is your hairdresser." They pushed me harder, forcing me toward the open flap of the tent. I was humiliated. I was in pain. I was being treated like a criminal at my own sister's wedding. But through the anger, I felt a strange sense of calm, because I knew something they did not. I knew that the tracking beacon on my bracelet had been activated the moment my heart rate spiked, and I knew that my extraction team was not just coming. They were already here. Just as the guard prepared to shove me through the exit, I locked eyes with him. "Remember this moment," I said, "because it is the last time you will ever feel powerful." The guard scoffed at my warning, his fingers digging deeper into my arm. He opened his mouth to make another crude joke about my empty threats, but the words never left his lips. A low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the soles of my feet. It started as a distant hum like thunder rolling over the ocean, but within seconds it escalated into a deafening roar that swallowed the entire world. Suddenly, a blinding column of white light cut through the late afternoon sky, spotlighting the garden like a divine intervention. It was so bright that the guests shielded their eyes, squinting up into the heavens in confusion. The roar became physical, a wall of noise that shook the champagne flutes right off the tables. It was the unmistakable, terrifying sound of rotor blades slicing through the air directly above us. A sleek, jet-black helicopter descended from the clouds, its nose pointed aggressively at the lawn. It was not a news chopper or a tourist ride. It was a military-grade machine, dark and menacing, bearing a golden insignia that shimmered even in the shadows. As it lowered towards the golf course behind the garden, the downdraft hit the wedding party with the force of a hurricane. The perfectly arranged floral centerpieces were ripped from their vases, sending white orchid petals swirling through the air like a snowstorm. Expensive linen napkins and tablecloths whipped violently, knocking over bottles of vintage wine and sending china plates crashing to the stone patio. The guests screamed, clutching their hats, and their expensive hairdos scrambling for cover, as the manicured reception turned into a chaotic wind tunnel. The meticulously planned event was being dismantled by pure horsepower in a matter of seconds. The security guards, who moments ago felt like titans, were now just terrified men in cheap suits. They looked up at the descending metal beast, their mouths hanging open in shock. The sheer intimidation of the machine made them instinctively recoil. Their grip on my arms loosened, then vanished completely as they took a step back, shielding their faces from the flying debris and dust. I did not run. I did not cover my head. I stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, the wind whipping my damp hair around my face, watching the helicopter touch down. The look of terror on Jamal's face as he watched his perfect wedding dissolve into chaos was worth every second of the previous humiliation. He looked at the helicopter, then at me, and for the first time I saw the color drain from his face as he realized this was not a coincidence. The wind from the helicopter rotors was just beginning to die down when a loud metallic crash echoed from the main entrance of the estate. The heavy wrought iron gates, which had been locked to keep out the press, were not just opened. They were breached. 12 men poured onto the lawn with the synchronized precision of a SWAT team. They were not wearing the ill-fitting polyester uniforms of event security. They were dressed in bespoke black tactical suits, their eyes hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses with earpieces coiling down into their collars. They moved in a phalanx, cutting through the terrified wedding guests like a knife through warm butter. Jamal's two hired goons were still gripping my arms, though their confidence had evaporated the moment the helicopter landed. They looked at the approaching unit with wide, fearful eyes, freezing like deer in headlights. They had no time to react. The lead agent, a towering man with a scar running down his jawline, closed the distance in 3 long strides. He did not ask them to let go. He acted. With a movement too fast for the guests to track, the lead agent grabbed the wrist of the guard, twisting my shoulder. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage followed by a scream of agony as the guard was forced to his knees. Simultaneously, 2 other agents tackled the second guard, pinning him face down into the manicured grass before he could even raise a hand. "Release her," the lead agent commanded, his voice devoid of emotion, but terrifying in its authority. I felt the pressure on my arms vanish instantly. I rubbed my bruising wrists, watching as the 2 men who had just assaulted me were neutralized and zip-tied with humiliating efficiency. The lead agent turned to me, his demeanor shifting from lethal weapon to deferential protector. He bowed his head slightly, ignoring the chaos around us. "I apologize for the delay, madam," he said, his voice crisp and professional. "Traffic control was uncooperative." "Are you injured?" I shook my head, straightening my spine. "I am fine, Commander. Just get them away from me." He nodded once, then tapped his earpiece, his voice booming across the silent garden for everyone, including my trembling sister and pale-faced brother-in-law, to hear. "Target secured. The mistress is safe. Perimeter is under our control." The 12 men instantly formed a protective human wall around me, their backs turned to me, facing the wedding party. They created an impenetrable circle of black suits, isolating me from the family that had tried to cast me out. Behind the wall of agents, I saw my father drop his Scotch glass. It shattered on the patio, but the sound was insignificant compared to the shockwave that had just hit them. They were no longer looking at Audrey the librarian. They were looking at a woman protected by a private army. The sudden silence that descended on the garden was heavier than the wind had been. The 12 men in black tactical gear stood motionless, their backs to me, forming a human iron curtain that separated me from the rest of the world. Beyond their shoulders, I could see the color drain from the faces of my family. The transformation was absolute. Moments ago, they were the masters of the universe, mocking the poor relation. Now they looked like criminals caught in the beam of a searchlight. Jamal was the first to break. He looked as if he was about to vomit. He was trembling so violently that the ice in his empty glass clattered against the crystal like a distress signal. In his mind, this was not a rescue mission. It was a raid. He assumed the Securities and Exchange Commission had finally sent a tactical team to drag him away for his Ponzi scheme. He backed away from the head table, his hands raising instinctively in a pathetic gesture of surrender, his eyes darting toward the back exit, only to find it blocked by 2 more agents. "I did not do it," Jamal stammered, his voice cracking and high-pitched. "Whatever you think I did, I have an explanation. My accountant handles the liquidity. Talk to him. I am just the face of the fund." He was confessing to crimes nobody had even mentioned yet. My father, seeing the military precision of the unit and hearing Jamal's panicked defense, immediately assumed the worst. He physically stepped away from his son-in-law, severing their alliance in a heartbeat to save his own skin. He looked at the agents with wide, terrified eyes. "We have nothing to do with his business," Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the groom. "We are just the in-laws. We did not sign anything. Do not arrest us." But it was Brittany who shattered the paralysis. She did not care about the legal implications or the safety of her husband. She only saw that her spotlight had been stolen. She stormed forward, grabbing a bottle of expensive wine by the neck like a weapon, her face twisted in an ugly mask of entitlement. She did not look scared. She looked furious. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, the veins in her neck bulging against her diamond necklace. "Who are you people? You are ruining my wedding. Get off my lawn right now. Someone call the police. I want them arrested." She hurled the bottle. It shattered harmlessly against the Kevlar vest of the nearest agent. He did not flinch. He did not turn around. To him, my sister was just background noise, a civilian tantrum that posed zero threat to the asset he was paid to protect. This indifference infuriated her more than violence would have. The guests were huddled in clumps, whispering frantically, their phones recording everything. "Is it the FBI?" one asked. "Is it the cartel?" another whispered. Jamal must be into something deep. I stood safely inside the circle, smoothing my dress. They were all looking at the agents, terrified of the guns. But they should have been looking at the helicopter door, which was slowly opening to reveal the man who actually held their fate in his hands. They thought the police were their worst nightmare. They were wrong. The helicopter engines began to wind down, the deafening roar, fading into a high-pitched whine that sounded like a turbine spinning down. As the dust from the golf course settled, the true magnificence of the machine was revealed. It was not a rental. It was a custom Augusta Westland, painted in a deep obsidian black that seemed to absorb the sunlight. On the tail boom, shimmering in legitimate 24-karat gold leaf, was a logo that every businessman in the tri-state area recognized instantly. It was a stylized shield crossed with a trident, the corporate sigil of Knight Logistics. My father, Richard, who had been cowering behind a waiter during the landing, was the first to squint through the debris. He wiped his glasses with a trembling hand and took a step forward, his greed instantly overriding his fear. He stared at the golden logo, his mouth falling open in a display of pure, unadulterated awe. To a man like my father, who measured human worth strictly by bank account balances, the symbol on that helicopter was the equivalent of a religious icon. "That is the Knight crest," Richard whispered, his voice trembling so much that it was barely audible over the dying engine. "Oh my God, that is Sebastian Knight." He turned to the wedding guests, his face flushed with a sudden manic excitement. He pointed at the black helicopter as if he had summoned it himself. "Do you see that logo?" he shouted, grabbing the arm of a confused senator standing nearby. "That is Knight Logistics. That is Sebastian Knight inside that chopper. The king of the ports. The man owns half the shipping containers in the Atlantic Ocean. He is worth billions, not millions, billions." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The name Sebastian Knight was legendary in financial circles, not just for his wealth but for his reclusive nature and his ruthless business tactics. He was a ghost who moved markets with a single signature. For him to appear at a garden wedding in Newport was an event of astronomical improbability. Richard looked at Jamal, who was still pale and sweating near the head table. My father's mind began to race, connecting dots that did not exist. He desperately wanted to believe that this visit was a validation of his family's social standing. "Why is he here?" Richard muttered, smoothing his disheveled hair and straightening his tie. "He must be here for business." "Yes, that has to be it." "Jamal, did you reach out to him? Is Titan Capital managing his portfolio now?" He did not wait for an answer. The possibility that the great Sebastian Knight had come to pay respects to his son-in-law was too intoxicating to ignore. It was the lifeline my father needed to save his crumbling ego. He forgot about me. He forgot about the bodyguards. He forgot about the debt. All he saw was the ultimate prize sitting on the 18th hole. "It is a surprise visit," Richard announced to the crowd, his voice gaining confidence. "Everyone, please compose yourselves. We are about to welcome a titan of industry. Make room. Show some respect." He began to walk toward the helicopter, puffing out his chest, ready to greet the man who had actually come to destroy him. The transition was grotesque to watch. One moment Jamal was trembling like a criminal awaiting a sentence, and the next, upon hearing the name Sebastian Knight, he was preening like a peacock. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and aggressively wiped the sweat from his forehead. He straightened his tie, shot his cuffs, and looked at the crowd with a smile that was all teeth and ambition. "Of course," Jamal announced, his voice booming with renewed confidence. "I should have known. I sent a proposal to Knight Logistics last month regarding a strategic partnership for their Asian shipping routes. They must have reviewed the numbers. This is not a raid, everyone. This is a business meeting. A very lucrative one." He turned to Brittany, who was still clutching the neck of the broken wine bottle. "Baby, put that down," he commanded. "Fix your hair. We are about to become the most powerful couple in Rhode Island." Sebastian Knight does not make house calls for just anyone. He is here to sign the deal of the century with me. The delusion was contagious. My mother Patricia instantly smoothed her dress, her face transforming from terrified matriarch to eager socialite. My father buttoned his jacket, looking at the helicopter with hungry eyes. They completely forgot about the FBI, the debt, and the fact that they were moments away from ruin. Greed is a powerful amnesiac. "Let us go!" Richard shouted, waving his hand. "Come on, everyone. We need to welcome our guest properly. Jamal, you stand in the front." Brittany hold his arm. "Look successful." Like a flock of sheep responding to a dinner bell, my entire family turned their backs on me. They literally ran across the lawn, their expensive shoes sinking into the soft grass, jostling each other to get to the front of the line. They abandoned me in the center of the garden, surrounded by the 12 agents without a backward glance. To them, I was still just the embarrassment to be hidden away while the man in the helicopter was their savior. I stood there shivering slightly in the cooling air, watching them line up near the rotor wash. They looked so small, so desperate, craning their necks to see the door open. Jamal stood at the front chest, puffed out hand extended, ready to shake the hand of the man he thought was his partner. He had no idea that the hand he was waiting for was wearing a wedding ring that matched the one on my finger. I crossed my arms and waited for the show to begin. The hydraulic door of the helicopter slid open with a smooth, expensive hiss that silenced the murmuring crowd. A set of retractable steps lowered onto the grass, and for a moment nobody moved. Then a polished black Oxford shoe stepped onto the turf, followed by the man himself. Sebastian Knight emerged from the dark cabin, like a modern-day emperor stepping onto conquered soil. He was taller than he looked in the magazines, his broad shoulders filling out a charcoal gray three-piece suit that was clearly bespoke Italian tailoring. Every inch of him screamed power, from the way he adjusted his platinum cufflinks to the cold, calculated expression on his face behind dark aviator sunglasses. Jamal, desperate to make contact, lunged forward. He extended his hand, his face plastered with a sweaty, ingratiating smile that looked painful to maintain. "Mr. Knight," Jamal practically shouted, his voice cracking with eagerness. "What an honor! I am Jamal the groom. I sent you the proposal for the Asian trade routes. Welcome to my wedding." My father Richard was right behind him, bowing slightly, looking like a servant greeting his master. "We are so humbled you could make it," Sir Richard added. "Please come this way to the head table. We have a seat for you." Sebastian did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not even turn his head. He walked straight past Jamal and Richard as if they were made of glass. He did not acknowledge the outstretched hand. He did not acknowledge their voices. He walked through the space they occupied with such absolute indifference that it was more insulting than a slap in the face. Jamal was left standing there, his hand shaking in empty air, his smile faltering as the realization of his insignificance crashed down on him. The guests watched in stunned silence as the billionaire ignored the groom completely. Sebastian removed his sunglasses with a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes, usually the color of cold steel, scanned the garden. He ignored the terrified guests. He ignored the weeping bride holding a broken wine bottle. He ignored the chaotic mess of the overturned tables. His gaze locked onto one thing and one thing only: me. He saw the water dripping from the hem of my ruined silk dress. He saw the way I was shivering slightly in the wind. He saw the red, angry fingerprints bruising the skin of my upper arms. For a fleeting second, a look of pure, unadulterated violence flashed across his face, a terrifying darkness that made the nearest security agent take a subtle step back. But just as quickly as it appeared, he masked it with professional, icy calm. He marched across the lawn, his long strides eating up the distance between us, his eyes never leaving mine. He was not here for business. He was here for war, and I was the only civilian he intended to save. Sebastian stopped inches from the fountain edge. He did not look at the mud staining his polished shoes. He did not look at the guests who were holding their breath in collective shock. He looked only at me. His expression softened instantly, shifting from the mask of a ruthless corporate raider to the face of the man who held me when I had nightmares. Without a word, he unbuttoned his charcoal gray suit jacket. It was a bespoke piece tailored in Milan, woven from vicuna wool, the most expensive fabric on earth. To him, it was just clothing. To my family, it represented more wealth than they had earned in a decade. He peeled the jacket off his broad shoulders and stepped onto the wet rim of the fountain. He did not care that the water splashed onto his trousers. He wrapped the heavy, warm garment around my shivering shoulders, pulling the lapels tight to shield me from the biting wind. The scent of sandalwood and sea salt enveloped me immediately, replacing the smell of stagnant water and humiliation. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell. I buried my face in the collar for a split second, allowing the warmth to seep into my frozen bones. For the first time all day, I stopped shaking. "I am sorry I am late, love," Sebastian said, his voice low and rumbly, meant only for my ears. The air traffic over Manhattan was a nightmare. I had the pilot bypass the regulations to get here as fast as I could. When the security team told me the beacon was triggered, I thought I would tear the sky apart to get to you. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, looking up into his steel blue eyes, which were scanning my face for injuries. I felt his large hand gently cup my cheek, his thumb brushing away a droplet of dirty water. "I am fine," I whispered, leaning into his touch. "You are actually perfect timing. You are just in time for the show." I looked over his shoulder at the frozen tableau of my family. My father was still standing with his hand half raised, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Jamal looked like he had seen a ghost. They were trying to process the visual information in front of them. The billionaire king of industry was ruining a $50,000 suit to comfort the woman they had just called trash. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on their faces. They could not compute that the golden goose they were chasing was married to the black sheep they had abused. Sebastian followed my gaze. He felt the tension in my body. He turned slowly, keeping one protective arm firmly around my waist, and faced the crowd. The tenderness vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, hard stare that had bankrupt competitors and dismantled hostile nations alike. He looked at my father, then at Jamal, and finally at my sister Brittany. He did not see in-laws. He saw targets. "Who did this?" Sebastian asked, his voice projecting across the silent garden without shouting, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My father took a step back, his face pale. He realized too late that the predator had not come to feed them. He had come to defend his mate, and they were the prey. My father finally gathered enough courage to breach the perimeter of silence that surrounded us. He scrambled forward, his expensive Italian loafers slipping slightly on the wet grass. He looked frantic, his eyes darting between the billionaire standing in the fountain and his own daughter, who was shivering in a $50,000 jacket. His brain was trying to solve a puzzle that his prejudice would not allow him to understand. He assumed Sebastian was being charitable, or perhaps mistaken. He could not conceive of a world where I was the protagonist. "Mr. Knight," Richard stammered, wringing his hands together in a display of pathetic subservience. "I apologize for the confusion. I do not know how you know my daughter, but please do not feel obligated to interact with her. She is just Audrey. She is a little unstable. We were actually just asking her to leave so she would not bother important guests like yourself." He reached out as if to pull me away, treating me like a stray dog that had wandered onto the porch. "Come on, Audrey," he hissed at me. "Give Mr. Knight his jacket back. You are embarrassing us." Sebastian did not move his body, but the temperature in the garden seemed to drop 10 degrees. He turned his head slowly to look at my father. It was the look a lion gives a hyena, right before it snaps its neck. He shifted his stance, placing himself physically between me and my father, blocking Richard's hand. "Did you just refer to her as just Audrey?" Sebastian asked, his voice deceptively soft, but carrying a resonance that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Richard blinked, confused by the tone. "Well, yes. She is nobody, really. Just a misunderstanding." Sebastian took one step forward. My father took 2 steps back. "Let me make something very clear to you, Richard," Sebastian said, and this time his voice was not soft. It was a blade. "If you ever refer to my wife as it, nobody, or just Audrey, Again, I will not call security. I will pick up my phone. I will call the chairman of the First National Bank who happens to be a close personal friend, and I will buy the note on your overdue mortgage. Then I will accelerate the foreclosure process and have you evicted from your home before the sun goes down tonight. Do you understand me? The word wife hung in the air like a nuclear warhead that had just detonated. It echoed off the stone walls of the mansion and reverberated through the silent crowd. For a moment, time stopped. The guests froze with their drinks halfway to their mouths. My mother's jaw went slack. Then the sound of shattering glass pierced the silence. Brittany, standing 10 feet away, had lost all feeling in her hands. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers and smashed onto the patio stones, exploding into shards of crystal. She stared at us, her face draining of all color, her lips moving but making no sound. The concept was too big for her to swallow. The sister she had mocked, the sister she had pushed into a fountain, was the wife of the most powerful man in the hemisphere. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been obliterated. The sound of Brittany's crystal glass shattering against the patio stones seemed to be the signal for my voice to finally be heard. I stepped closer to Sebastian, leaning into his warmth, and looked at the faces of the people who had spent 3 decades making me feel small. They looked paralyzed. My mother was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. My father looked like he was having a cardiac event. And Brittany looked as if someone had just told her that the earth was flat. Since you all seem to be having a hard time processing the visual information, let me make the introductions formal, I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady in the silence. I am not Audrey the librarian. I am Audrey Knight. And this man, the one you are terrified of, is Sebastian. He is my husband. A collective gasp went through the crowd. I saw Mrs. Sterling's jaw drop. We eloped 2 years ago in a private ceremony on Lake Como. I continued enjoying every syllable. We did not send invitations because, quite frankly, we wanted to be surrounded by people who actually loved us. And Sebastian is a very busy man. Earning billions of dollars in international logistics does not leave much free time for mingling with distant relatives. I let the words distant relatives hang in the air. I had just demoted my immediate family to the status of strangers. The insult hit its mark. My mother flinched as if I had slapped her. Sebastian did not smile at my introduction. He did not offer a polite nod to his new in-laws. His attention was entirely focused on me. He gently took my left hand, lifting it with the delicacy one would use to handle a rare artifact. He pushed back the oversized sleeve of the suit jacket he had draped over me. There, stark and angry against my pale skin, were the deep red welts in the shape of fingerprints left by the security guard who had twisted my arm. The temperature in the garden seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Sebastian stared at the bruise. His thumb traced the edge of the red mark, his touch feather light, a stark contrast to the violence that had caused it. Then, in a gesture that was both incredibly tender and terrifyingly possessive, he lowered his head and pressed his lips softly against the injured skin. He kissed the bruise, lingering for a second before raising his head. When he looked up, his eyes were no longer blue. They were black with a cold, predatory rage. He did not shout. He did not scream. He spoke in a whisper that was louder than the helicopter engine had been. Who did this? Sebastian asked. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at my father. Who put their hands on my wife? I want a name, Richard, and I want it now. My father took a stumbling step back, crashing into a waiter. He realized that the man standing in the fountain was not a business partner. He was an executioner, and he was looking for someone to punish. The silence that followed Sebastian's demand for a name was thick enough to choke on. While my father, Richard, looked like a deer caught in headlights, Jamal looked like a man standing on a trapdoor that was about to open. He knew exactly who Sebastian Knight was. In the world of finance, Sebastian was not just a billionaire. He was a shark who swallowed smaller fish for sport. Jamal knew that Titan Capital, his fraudulent hedge fund, was barely a speck of dust compared to the empire my husband controlled. If Sebastian decided to look in Jamal's direction, he would not just see a bad brother-in-law, he would see a criminal. I watched the blood drain from Jamal's face. His knees actually knocked together, a sound I had only heard in cartoons, but was witnessing now in real time. He took a stumbling step back, his eyes darting to the exit, realizing there was no escape past the wall of 12 agents. He had just offered a minimum wage pool cleaning job to the wife of the man who could buy and sell his entire existence before breakfast. The realization of his fatal error was crushing him. But while the men were paralyzed by fear, the women were calculating their survival. Odette Jamal's mother decided that loyalty to her son was less important than self-preservation. She smoothed the sequins on her tacky gold dress and forced a smile onto her face that was so wide and unnatural it looked like a rictus of pain. She stepped over the shards of the wine glass Brittany had dropped and marched toward us, her arms open wide, as if she were approaching a long-lost daughter. "Audrey, darling." Odette cooed, her voice pitching up an octave into a sickeningly sweet falsetto. She ignored the fact that 10 minutes ago she had thrown my gift into the dirt. "Oh, look at us. We have all had a bit too much champagne and emotions are running high. It is a wedding after all." She stopped just short of Sebastian, intimidated by the sheer violence radiating from him, and focused her laser beam gaze on me. "You know how much we love you, Audrey. We were just having a bit of fun, a little family roasting. It is our way of showing affection. We had no idea you had married so well. Why did you keep it a secret? If we had known you were Mrs. Knight, we would have given you the seat of honor." She reached out a hand to touch my arm, the same arm her security guards had bruised. "Come now, let us start over." Odette continued, desperate to rewrite history. "Introduce us properly. I am sure Mr. Knight would love to discuss investment opportunities with Jamal. We are all family here, right?" I looked at her manicured hand hovering in the air. It was the same hand that had treated me like a disease. I felt Sebastian tense beside me, ready to snap her hand off if she touched me. But I did not need him to fight this battle. I looked at Odette, then at Jamal, and finally at my sister. The fear in their eyes was delicious, but it was not enough. They thought they could smooth this over with a fake apology and a business deal. They were wrong. Sebastian did not take the hand Odette offered. He looked at it like it was a contagious disease. Without saying a word to her, he raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. It was a sharp, crisp sound that cut through the garden noise. Immediately, his executive assistant, who had silently set up a laptop near the DJ booth, hit the enter key. The massive LED screen behind the main stage, which had been displaying a romantic slideshow of Brittany and Jamal posing in Paris, suddenly glitched. The image of them kissing in front of the Eiffel Tower vanished, replaced by a stark high-contrast document. It was a bank statement, then another, then a flowchart with red arrows pointing in circles. The header on the documents was unmistakable. It read, "Titan Capital Forensic Audit." The music stopped. The guests turned their heads toward the glowing screen. Sebastian crossed his arms, his face impassive. "You wanted to talk business," Odette. Sebastian said, his voice cold. "So let us look at the portfolio." I stepped forward, pointing at the screen as the pages scrolled automatically. "This is what a Ponzi scheme looks like, everyone," I announced, my voice steady. "Look at the column on the left. That is the money Jamal took from new investors last week. Now look at the column on the right. That money did not go into stocks or bonds. It went directly into paying off the investors from last month who were threatening to sue. He is robbing Peter to pay Paul and keeping the change for himself." Jamal let out a strangled cry, trying to run toward the stage to unplug the screen, but two of Sebastian's agents blocked his path without even drawing their weapons. He bounced off their chests and fell onto the grass. I walked over to where he lay and looked down at him. "And let us talk about your lifestyle, Jamal. You like to play the part of the tycoon. But let us look at the receipts." I pointed to the silver car gleaming on the lawn. "That Porsche GT3 you gifted my sister. It is not yours. It belongs to Gotham Exotics, a rental agency in Jersey City. I saw the rental agreement in your email outbox. You paid $600 for a 24-hour lease. You have to return it by midnight, or they will charge late fees to a credit card that is already maxed out." Jamal shook his head frantically, sweat pouring down his face. "No, that is a lie," he screamed. I turned my gaze to his wrist. And that Rolex Daytona, I am an appraiser, Jamal. I know gold from gold-plated steel. A real Daytona has a sweeping second-hand movement. Yours ticks. It is a super clone fake made in China. You paid maybe $400 for it. I leaned in closer, my shadow falling over his terrified face. You are a fraud, Jamal. You are not a billionaire. You are just a broke con artist playing dress-up with Monopoly money. The only thing real about you is the prison sentence you are about to receive. The revelation that Jamal was a fraud did not just ruin the wedding. It shattered the delicate truce that held my family together. For years they had been united by a shared greed and a mutual desire to look down on me. But the moment the money evaporated, their loyalty dissolved with it. My father Richard stared at the red numbers on the LED screen, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The millions he thought he had secured were gone. The retirement fund he had handed over to Jamal was gone. And the house he had leveraged to the hilt was now just collateral for a criminal enterprise. Richard let out a guttural roar that sounded more animal than human. He abandoned all pretense of dignity and lunged at the groom. He grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his rented tuxedo, shaking him so violently that I heard the fabric tear. They crashed into the head table, knocking over the wedding cake. The 5-tier confection toppled in slow motion, smashing onto the grass and splattering frosting onto their expensive shoes. You lied to me, Richard screamed, spit flying onto Jamal's face. I gave you everything. I signed over the deed to the lake house this morning because you said you needed liquidity for the merger. There is no merger, is there? You stole it. You stole my house. Jamal, desperate and cornered, fought back. He shoved my father away, his eyes wild with panic and malice. He straightened his torn jacket, looking at the man he was supposed to call Dad with pure contempt. Do not act like a victim, old man. Jamal spat, his voice loud enough for the back row to hear. You were not investing. You were gambling. You saw the returns I promised, and you got greedy. You did not care where the money came from as long as it kept you in your country club. Richard tried to lunge again, but he tripped over the debris of the cake. Jamal stood over him, sneering. And let us be honest, Richard. You did not approve of this marriage because you liked me. You approved of it because you are broke. You were selling your daughter to pay your debts. You practically shoved Brittany down the aisle because you needed a bailout. You are not a father. You are a pimp in a polyester suit. The word hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. The guests who had previously watched with shock were now fully engaged in the spectacle. The initial horror had faded, replaced by the voyeuristic hunger of a Colosseum crowd. Smartphones were raised high in the air, recording every punch and every insult. Live streams were going out to thousands of viewers, broadcasting the collapse of the family dynasty in real time. I saw Mrs. Sterling, the wealthy investor, zooming in with her camera, shaking her head as she captured the moment my father tried to crawl out of the wedding cake frosting. They were no longer the envy of Newport. They were a viral joke. I stood next to Sebastian, watching them tear each other apart, and I felt absolutely nothing but the cold satisfaction of justice. They were finally showing the world exactly who they were. Brittany stepped right over Jamal's prone body, as if he were a piece of discarded furniture. She did not care that her husband had just been exposed as a criminal. She did not care that our father was hyperventilating into a napkin. All she cared about was the fact that her perfect day was being dismantled and her narcissism demanded a target. She smoothed her dress, which was now stained with frosting and wine, and marched toward Sebastian and me. She pointed a shaking finger at us, her face twisted into a mask of pure entitlement. I do not care what your spreadsheets say, Brittany screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. This is my wedding. My name is on the invitation. I rented this estate for the entire weekend. This is my property until Sunday morning. She turned to the crowd, desperate for validation. Someone call the police. These people are trespassing. I want them removed. I paid $50,000 for this venue, and I have rights. You cannot just land a helicopter in the middle of a private event and start lecturing us. Get out! She stomped her foot like a toddler, expecting the world to bend to her will. But the venue manager, a man named Pierre, who had been watching from the sidelines with a look of extreme anxiety, did not step forward to support her. In fact, he looked like he wanted to disappear into the hedges. I stepped forward, cutting off her tantrum with a laugh that was devoid of any humor. "You really do not listen, do you, Brittany?" I said, shaking my head. "You keep using that word rented. But to rent something, a transaction actually has to occur. Money has to change hands." I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen, holding it up so she could see the call log. "The owner of this estate called me this morning at 9 o'clock. Do you know why he called me? Because when he tried to run the final deposit on Jamal's credit card, the machine did not just decline it, it flagged it as stolen." Brittany froze her mouth open. "That is right," I continued, my voice hard. "The contract was voided 5 hours ago. The only reason the staff let you in the gates was because they were waiting for the police to arrive to arrest Jamal for credit card fraud. You are not the hostess of this party, Brittany. You are a squatter. You have been drinking stolen champagne on property that you have absolutely no legal right to be on. So when you tell us to get out, you might want to lower your voice. Because technically you are the one breaking the law just by standing there." The guests began to whisper furiously. The humiliation was total. Brittany looked at the venue manager, begging him to contradict me, but Pierre simply looked down at his shoes, confirming everything I had just said. She was a bride with no groom, no money, and now no venue. Brittany looked like she had been slapped. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land, unable to process the fact that her credit card, or rather Jamal's stolen credit card, had failed. She looked around the garden, desperate to find a loophole, desperate to find some way to assert her dominance over the sister she had spent a lifetime bullying. "But I paid the deposit," she screeched, clutching at straws. "I have a receipt from 6 months ago. You cannot just cancel a wedding in the middle of the vows. I have rights of possession." Sebastian finally stepped forward. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, the one he was not wearing, because it was currently keeping me warm, and pulled out a sleek blue leather folder. It was not a rental agreement. It was a deed. "Actually, Brittany, there is a slight correction to be made," Sebastian said, his voice smooth and carrying a lethal calm. "The rental contract was indeed voided. But that is irrelevant now, because as of this morning, this venue is no longer a rental property." He opened the folder and held it up. The document inside was stamped with the official seal of the City of Newport Recorder of Deeds. Audrey mentioned to me last week that she admired the architecture of this estate. She said it was the only dignified thing about this entire event. "So while you were getting your hair done this morning, I made a call to the owner. I made him an offer he could not refuse. The transaction closed at 10 o'clock sharp. I bought the entire estate." The guests gasped so loudly it sounded like the air was being sucked out of the garden. Sebastian turned the document around so Brittany could read the bold black print at the bottom of the page. "Read the name on the deed, Brittany," Sebastian commanded. Brittany squinted through her tears. Her eyes widened in horror as she read the line next to owner of record. "It says Audrey Knight," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That is correct," Sebastian said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "I bought it for her. It is a wedding gift, which means you are not standing on a rented venue. You are standing in my wife's backyard." I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and my sister. I looked at the woman who had pushed me into a fountain, who had mocked my poverty, who had tried to erase me from her life. Now she was standing on my grass, surrounded by my security at my mercy. "So here is the situation, dear sister," I said, my voice cold and hard. "You are not the hostess. You are an intruder. You are trespassing on private property. And in the state of Rhode Island, I have the right to remove unwanted trespassers by any means necessary." "You wanted a memorable wedding, Brittany. Congratulations. You just got evicted from it." I walked past my sister, who was still trembling in her ruined dress, and stepped up onto the small raised platform where the wedding band had been playing. The musicians, sensing the shift in power, practically threw themselves out of my way. I reached out and grabbed the microphone from the stand. The high-pitched whine of feedback sliced through the air, silencing the few remaining whispers. I looked out at the sea of faces. These were the same people who had laughed when I fell, the same people who had filmed my humiliation. Now they looked like deer caught in the crosshairs of a hunter's rifle. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The speakers carried my words with crystal clear definition to every corner of the estate. Attention, everyone. I said, my voice calm and authoritative. The wedding is officially cancelled due to fraud and lack of funds. Furthermore, you are currently standing on private property owned by the Knight family. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate the premises. I paused, letting the weight of the deadline sink in. I looked at my watch, then back at the crowd. At 5 minutes and 1 second, the gates will be locked and anyone still inside will be detained by private security and handed over to the Newport Police Department for criminal trespassing. I suggest you start running. The effect was immediate and chaotic. It was not a dignified exit. It was a stampede. The veneer of high society crumbled instantly. Senators pushed past elderly women to get to the exit. Socialites in 6-inch heels stumbled over the uneven grass, abandoning their designer clutches in a desperate bid to reach the valet stand. People were shouting for their cars, waving tickets in the air, terrified of being associated with a crime scene. The valet drivers were overwhelmed. I watched as a prominent local investor who had mocked my book gift earlier decided not to wait for his Mercedes. He simply started jogging down the long driveway, his tuxedo tails flapping in the wind. Mrs. Sterling, the woman who had live-streamed the fight, was frantically trying to delete the video from her phone as she speed-walked toward the gate, terrified of a lawsuit. Within 3 minutes, the garden was a ghost town of overturned chairs, half-eaten cake, and broken glass. The only people left were the staff, who looked relieved that they might actually get paid by the new owner, and my immediate family. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal stood alone in the center of the wreckage. They had no car to run to because the bank had already repossessed it. They were stranded on an island of their own making, and the tide was rising fast. The silence that descended on the estate after the last guest fled was heavy enough to crush bones. The garden, once filled with the laughter of 200 people, was now a graveyard of broken glass and ruined dreams. Standing amidst the debris were 4 people who had lost everything in the span of an hour. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal. They were no longer the titans of Newport. They were castaways. They looked at the line of 12 security agents blocking the exit. They looked at the helicopter. Then inevitably, they looked at me. The realization that I was their only lifeline washed over them. The arrogance that had defined them for decades evaporated, replaced by a pathetic, desperate survival instinct. Patricia was the first to break. My stepmother, the woman who had spent years critiquing my posture and my career, suddenly collapsed to her knees in the dirt. She did not care about her couture gown anymore. She crawled toward me, her mascara running down her face in black streaks, her hands clasped together in a grotesque parody of prayer. My real mother worked 2 jobs until her heart gave out to build this family's wealth. She died of exhaustion, trying to secure my future. And what did you do? You moved in a month later and spent every dime of her life insurance on your plastic surgery and your parties. You did not raise me. You robbed me. You are not a parent. You are a parasite that has finally run out of hosts. I turned away from Patricia, who was still weeping on the ground, and walked over to my tote bag, which was resting on a dry patch of grass near the fountain. The family watched me with confused, teary eyes, unsure of what further humiliation I could possibly inflict upon them. I reached into the bag and pulled out the blue cloth-bound book. The Great Gatsby. The same book Odette had thrown into the dirt. The same book Jamal had called garbage. I walked back to the center of the group. I held the book up so they could all see it. The dust jacket was slightly bent at the corner, a permanent scar from their arrogance. I ran my hand over the cover, smoothing it out, with a deliberate slowness that made them anxious. You all laughed at this. I said, my voice steady and low. You called it trash. You said it was an insult to your wealth. But you never bothered to open it. You never bothered to look inside. I opened the front cover. There, tucked securely against the title page, was a rectangular slip of pale blue paper. It was not a bookmark. It was a cashier's check drawn from the private client account of the Knight Foundation. I pulled it out and held it up to the fading sunlight. The watermark shimmered clearly. The numbers were typed in bold black ink. My father, Richard, squinted, his glasses sliding down his nose. He took a step closer, his breath hitching in his throat as his brain processed the zeros. "That is a check for $2 million, Richard whispered, the color draining from his face as the magnitude of his mistake crashed down on him. I nodded. "It is. Or rather, it was." I looked at Brittany, who was staring at the piece of paper with a hunger that was almost feral. "I came here today with this in my bag." I continued, letting the words hang in the cold air. "Despite everything you did to me, despite the years of making me sleep in the guest room, despite the way you made me pay rent in my own childhood home, I still had a tiny, foolish shred of pity left for you. I knew you were drowning in debt. I knew the bank was coming for the house." I looked at my father. "This was for you, Richard. It was enough to pay off the mortgage and clear your gambling debts." I looked at my stepmother. "It was enough to cover your credit cards, Patricia." Then I looked at my sister. "And Brittany, there was enough left over to give you actual capital for a real business so you would not have to marry a fraud just to buy purses. I was going to give this to you as a wedding gift. I was going to save you one last time. All you had to do was be decent. All you had to do was treat me like a human being for one single afternoon." The silence was absolute. The only sound was the wind rustling the check in my hand. They stared at the paper as if it were a holy relic. It was their salvation. It was their freedom. And it was right there, inches from their faces. "But you could not do it," I said, my voice hardening. "You could not go 5 minutes without mocking me. You threw the book. You threw the gift. And in doing so, you threw away the only chance you had left." The check for $2 million was crisp in my hand. It was the only clean thing left in this entire garden. My father's eyes were locked onto the blue paper as if it were a religious artifact. He was already mentally spending it, calculating how he could pay off the mortgage and keep his country club membership. He was so blinded by greed that he didn't see the lighter in my eyes. He thought I was still his daughter. He thought I was still the girl who sought his approval. He was wrong. "I am not a bank, Richard," I said softly. "And I am not a charity. I am a lesson you should have learned 20 years ago." I took the check in both hands. The sound of the thick, expensive paper tearing was sharp and violent in the quiet garden. It sounded like a bone snapping. My father let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure animal distress, reaching out as if he could physically stop the sound. "Don't," he gasped, stumbling forward. "Audrey, don't you dare! That is my money!" I didn't even blink. I put the two halves together and tore them again. Now the check was in quarters. $2 million had just become 4 pieces of worthless blue confetti. I turned around and walked to the edge of the large stone fountain, the same fountain where the water was now murky with algae and dead leaves. I held my hand over the center of the pool. "You want it so bad," I said, looking at my family. "Then go get it." I opened my fingers. The pieces of paper fluttered down, caught by the wind for a brief second before landing softly on the surface of the dirty water. They began to soak up the grime immediately, the ink bleeding into the wet pulp. For a split second, nobody moved. Then instinct took over. My father, a man who prided himself on his dignity and his Italian suits, did not hesitate. He vaulted over the stone rim of the fountain, with a desperation that was painful to watch. He splashed into the waist-deep water, slipping on the mossy bottom, and fell to his hands and knees. He didn't care that he was ruining a $3,000 tuxedo. He was frantically scooping at the water, trying to grab the disintegrating pieces of paper before they sank. "No, no, no!" Richard screamed, clawing at the surface. "Help me! Someone help me get them!" Brittany was right behind him. She didn't care about her wedding dress. She didn't care about her makeup. She jumped in beside him, pushing her own father out of the way to grab a piece of the check. They were like starving animals fighting over a scrap of meat. Brittany shoved Richard, he shoved her back, and they both scrambled in the mud, grasping at wet paper that was dissolving in their hands. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. The great Richard Knight and his princess daughter reduced to scavengers in a dirty pond. Sebastian put his hand on my shoulder, pulling me back slightly, shielding me from the splash. We stood there dry and untouchable, looking down at the people who had tried to drown me, watching them drown themselves in their own greed. They were soaking wet, covered in slime, holding fistfuls of wet pulp that was now worth absolutely nothing. They had lost their dignity, their money, and their humanity all in the span of 10 seconds. And I didn't feel a thing. The pathetic splashing in the fountain was suddenly drowned out by a sound that made my father freeze mid-gasp. It was the wail of sirens. Not the polite chirp of a local patrol car, but the deafening coordinated scream of a federal raid. Blue and red strobe lights began to flash against the white stone of the mansion, turning the garden into a disorienting nightmare of color and noise. A convoy of black SUVs tore up the driveway, bypassing the valet stand and crushing the remaining flower beds. Doors flew open in unison. Men and women in blue windbreakers with yellow letters on the back poured out. FBI, SEC. This was not a noise complaint. This was a takedown. Jamal tried to run. He scrambled up from the grass, slipping in his rented shoes, and made a break for the hedges. He did not make it 10 feet. 2 agents tackled him with professional efficiency, driving his face into the dirt. I watched as they hauled him up, mud smeared across his cheek. The lead agent recited his rights with a bored, practiced tone. Jamal Sterling, you are under arrest for 18 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and operating a Ponzi scheme. You have the right to remain silent. The metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, sealing his fate. Jamal screamed, thrashing against the agents. It was not me, he yelled, looking frantically at my father. It was Richard. He gave me the money. He is the mastermind. Arrest him. My father, still waist-deep in the fountain, turned pale. Even in his final moments of freedom, Jamal was trying to drag everyone else down with him. But the agents were not done. Odette tried to walk away, clutching her purse as if she were just a bystander. She smoothed her dress, trying to look like a victim. She walked briskly toward the gate, keeping her head down. But an agent blocked her path. Odette Sterling, put your hands behind your back, she shrieked, dropping her bag. Me, she cried, her voice cracking. I am just his mother. I am a senior citizen. You cannot touch me. The agent did not blink. You are listed as the primary signatory on the Cayman Island shell accounts used to launder the stolen funds, Mrs. Sterling. We have your signature on the transfer documents. You are coming with us for conspiracy and money laundering. As they slapped the handcuffs on her wrists, Odette looked at Jamal with pure hatred. The mother and son who had sneered at my poverty were now being shoved into the back of separate federal vehicles. Sebastian leaned down to my ear, his voice calm amidst the chaos. I had my legal team send the forensic accounting file to the district attorney about an hour ago. They were very eager to close this case. It seems your brother-in-law has been on their radar for months. They just needed the hard evidence to move in. I watched the flashing lights illuminate the terrified faces of my father and sister. They stood in the fountain, soaking wet and shivering, holding their wet paper scraps, watching the only people who might have bailed them out get hauled away to federal prison. The party was officially over. The last of the black federal SUVs disappeared down the long, winding driveway, their red and blue lights fading into the twilight like the dying embers of a fire. The aggressive wail of the sirens grew distant, leaving behind a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of total, irreversible ruin. The garden, which had been manicured to perfection just hours ago, now looked like a battlefield. The white roses were trampled into the mud. The expensive silk tablecloths were stained with wine and footprints. The wedding cake lay in a heap of sugar and regret on the grass, swarming with ants. In the center of this wreckage stood the remnants of the Knight family. They were a portrait of absolute misery. My father Richard was soaked to the bone. His $3,000 Italian tuxedo was ruined, heavy with the algae-filled water from the fountain. He stood shivering uncontrollably, his hair plastered to his skull, water dripping from his nose like tears he was too in shock to shed. Beside him, Patricia huddled in her soaked gown, her makeup running in black rivers down her face, transforming her into a grotesque clown. She looked old. For the first time in her life, the surgery and the Botox could not hide the fear that was eating her alive. But it was Brittany who was the most pathetic sight. The bride, the princess, the girl who was supposed to have it all. She had collapsed onto the wet grass, her legs sprawled out in front of her. Her custom designer wedding dress, which had cost more than my car, was brown with mud and green with grass stains. She was weeping a low, guttural sound of pure despair that echoed off the stone walls of the estate. In her hands, she still clutched the wet, dissolving clumps of blue paper. She stared at the mushy pulp as if she could will it back into $2 million. She tried to piece the fragments together on her lap, her shaking fingers tearing the wet paper even further, destroying the very thing she was trying to save. I watched them from the dryness of the patio. Sebastian stood silently behind me, a warm, solid presence against the chill of the evening. He did not speak. He knew this was my moment. He knew that I needed to bury the ghosts of my past before I could walk into my future. I stepped off the patio and walked onto the grass. My heels clicked softly on a patch of stone, the sound sharp in the quiet air. I stopped 5 feet away from my father. I did not offer him a towel. I did not offer him a hand. I simply looked at him. Richard looked up. His eyes were hollow. The arrogance that had defined him for 60 years was gone, extinguished by the cold water of reality. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to scold, but no sound came out. He was a king without a kingdom, standing in the ruins of his own greed. "I hope it was worth it, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the damp air. He blinked, confusion clouding his gaze. "The show," I continued. "The status. The desperate need to prove to strangers that you were important. You spent your entire life chasing people who did not care about you, and you trampled the only people who did. You mortgaged your house, you sold your integrity, you sold your daughter. And for what?" I pointed in the direction the police cars had gone. "For a photo op with a criminal." Richard flinched. He looked down at his muddy shoes, shame finally beginning to color his pale cheeks. "You wanted a rich son-in-law so badly," I said, my voice dripping with cold irony. "You were so desperate to secure the family legacy that you didn't bother to check if the gold was real. You just saw the flash and you bit the hook. Well, congratulations, Dad. You got exactly what you wanted. You are going to be on the front page of every newspaper in Rhode Island tomorrow morning." I took a step closer, forcing him to look me in the eye. "You wanted fame. You got it. You are now the father-in-law to the fraud of the century. You are the man who financed a Ponzi scheme. The banks aren't just going to take your house, Richard. They are going to take your reputation. They are going to audit every dime you have ever made. You won't just be poor. You will be a pariah. The country club won't let you in the service entrance, let alone the dining room." Patricia let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. "And you, Patricia," I said, turning my gaze to her. "You spent 20 years telling me I wasn't good enough to be a knight. You told me I was plain. You told me I was boring. You told me I should be more like Brittany." I looked down at my sister, who was still trying to assemble the puzzle of the wet check on her muddy lap. "Look at her, Patricia. Is this the masterpiece you created? A woman who is so hollow she married a felon for a lease on a car she couldn't drive. A woman who is currently sitting in the mud crying over money she didn't earn. You didn't raise a daughter. You raised a cautionary tale." Brittany looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She held up a handful of blue pulp, her voice trembling. "It is ruined," she whispered, her voice sounding like a child's. "It is all ruined. Why did you tear it up, Audrey? Why do you hate me so much?" I crouched down so I was eye level with her. I didn't touch her. I didn't want the mud on my dress. "I don't hate you, Brittany," I said softly. "Hate implies that I have energy to waste on you. I don't. I feel nothing for you. You are a stranger to me. A very sad, very expensive stranger. I tore that check up because you need to learn the one lesson Dad never taught you. Actions have consequences. You cannot treat people like garbage for decades and then expect them to pay your bills when the party is over." I stood up, smoothing my skirt. The wind was picking up, blowing the scent of the ocean through the garden. It smelled like freedom. "This estate belongs to me now," I announced, my voice echoing slightly. "My security team has instructions to secure the perimeter in 10 minutes. I suggest you start walking. The main gate is a mile away. It is going to be a long, cold walk in those shoes, but I think you can manage. You have a lot of thinking to do." Richard took a step forward, his hand reaching out. "Audrey, wait," he croaked, his voice raspy. "Where are we supposed to go?" "The house. The bank locked it. We have nowhere. You cannot just leave us here. We are your family." I looked at him, and for a second I remembered the little girl who used to wait by the window for him to come home, desperate for a pat on the head that never came. I killed that little girl in my mind right there and then. "Family," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue. "Family is the people who catch you when you fall, Richard, not the people who push you. I have a family. He is standing right behind me. You three? You are just people I used to know." I turned my back on them. It was the hardest and easiest thing I had ever done. I felt Sebastian's hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the helicopter. "Let's go home, Mrs. Knight," Sebastian said, his voice the only sound I wanted to hear. As we walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to see them to know they were still standing there, three dark shapes in the ruins of their own making, shivering in the dark as the first drops of real rain began to fall. The storm was just beginning for them, but for me, the sky was finally clear. The walk from the ruined garden to the awaiting helicopter was less than 50 yards, but it felt like crossing a bridge between two different dimensions. Behind me lay a world of mud deception and the suffocating weight of a family that had never loved me. Ahead of me lay the sleek obsidian machine that represented my freedom, my future, and the man who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. I did not rush. I let my heels sink slightly into the soft turf, feeling the ground beneath me for the last time. Sebastian kept his arm wrapped firmly around my waist, his body a shield against the wind and the lingering stares of the people we were leaving behind. The 12 security agents moved with us, a phalanx of black suits that parted the air like the Red Sea. They did not look back at the sobbing bride or the shivering parents. Their eyes were scanning the perimeter, professional and detached, ensuring that my exit was as flawless as my entrance should have been. As we approached the helicopter, the pilot engaged the rotors. The blades began to slice through the air with a rhythmic thumping that vibrated in my chest. It was a sound of power. The downdraft picked up again, sending a fresh wave of mist and loose leaves swirling back toward the fountain, forcing Richard and Patricia to shield their eyes. They were being physically pushed back by the force of my departure. One of the agents, the large man with the scar who had broken the wrist of my attacker, stepped forward and slid the cabin door open. The interior was not just a vehicle. It was a sanctuary. Cream leather seats, soft amber lighting, and a bottle of chilled water, waiting in a silver bucket. It was a capsule of silence and safety in the middle of the storm. Sebastian stepped up first, turning to offer me his hand. His grip was warm and solid. He did not pull me. He waited for me to choose to step up. I placed my hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm, and hoisted myself up the retractable step. As I sat down on the plush leather, the agent handed me a noise-canceling headset. I put it on, and the roar of the engine instantly vanished, replaced by a hum of quiet efficiency. Sebastian sat beside me, buckling my harness with the care one would give to a child. He adjusted the microphone near his lips and looked deep into my eyes. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Knight?" he asked, his voice clear and intimate in my ear. I nodded, leaning my head back against the headrest. "I am ready." The door slid shut, sealing us in. Through the thick tinted glass, I looked out at the garden one last time. The scene below was pathetic. My father, Richard, was standing by the empty valet stand, frantically gesturing at a spot where his Mercedes used to be. I watched as he pulled his phone out, dialing a number, then throwing his hands up in despair. Sebastian tapped my knee and pointed toward the main gate a mile down the winding access road. "I took the liberty of contacting the bank while you were giving your speech," Sebastian said calmly. Since the foreclosure was processed at 5 o'clock, the asset recovery team was authorized to secure all collateral. That included the vehicles purchased with the company credit line. I looked down at the driveway. A line of tow trucks was already exiting the main gate, hauling away my father's luxury sedan, my mother's convertible, and the white limousine that had brought Brittany to the wedding. They were gone. The driveway was empty. My family stood in the gathering darkness, illuminated only by the harsh red lights of the helicopter's tail beacon. They were wet, cold, and stranded. They were miles from the main highway in a gated community where Uber drivers were not allowed without a pass, and they had no phones, no cars, and no dignity. They would have to walk. They would have to trudge a mile in their ruined designer shoes, dragging their muddy couture gowns through the dirt, just to reach a public road where they could beg for a ride. The pilot received the clearance. The helicopter lurched gently, then lifted off the ground. The sensation of weightlessness was immediate. We rose straight up the ground, falling away beneath us. I watched as the figures of my family shrank. They became smaller and smaller until Richard was just a speck of black in the gray mud, and Brittany's white dress was nothing more than a dirty smudge on the green lawn. From this height, the mansion looked like a dollhouse. The fountain where they had scrambled for money looked like a dirty puddle. The grandeur they had fought so hard to project was revealed for what it really was. Small. Insignificant. Fragile. I looked at the road stretching out beyond the gates. It was dark and narrow, winding through the dense woods of Newport. I imagined them walking down that road, arguing, blaming each other, shivering in the cold night air. I imagined the silence between them, the heavy, suffocating realization that there was no one left to blame but themselves. Sebastian took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. He saw me looking down. "Do not waste your pity, Audrey," he said, his thumb stroking my knuckles. "They made their bed. Now they have to walk home in it." I turned away from the window. I looked at the man sitting next to me. He was wearing a t-shirt now, having given me his jacket, and he looked more regal in cotton than my father ever looked in silk. He had flown into a hurricane to save me. He had bought an estate just to prove a point. He had dismantled my enemies without raising his voice. "I am not pitying them," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "I am just admiring the view. The world looks so much cleaner from up here." The helicopter banked left, turning toward the ocean. The lights of the estate disappeared behind the tree line, swallowed by the darkness. Ahead of us, the lights of the city twinkled like diamonds on black velvet. Real diamonds. Not the fake cubic zirconia my parents tried to pass off as wealth. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The air in the cabin smelled of leather and Sebastian's cologne. It smelled like expensive peace. The nightmare was over. The debt was cancelled. The toxic ties were severed. I was no longer the poor relation. I was no longer the disappointment. I was Audrey Knight, and I was flying toward a horizon that was finally truly mine. As the helicopter accelerated, cutting through the clouds, I felt the last lingering weight of my childhood drop away, falling into the ocean below like a stone. I didn't look back. There was nothing back there worth seeing. The vibration of the helicopter was a low, steady thrum against my spine, a stark contrast to the chaotic shivering that had racked my body just minutes before. Outside the thick, tinted glass, the world had transformed. The dark, muddy misery of the estate was gone, replaced by a sprawling tapestry of light. We were flying over the coastline, where the ocean met the city, and the view was nothing short of a miracle. The lights of the towns below looked like spilled diamonds on black velvet, a chaotic yet beautiful constellation that stretched out to the horizon. I adjusted the noise-canceling headset over my ears, blocking out the mechanical whine of the rotors, until all I could hear was the rhythmic breathing of the man sitting next to me. I leaned my head onto Sebastian's shoulder. The cotton of his t-shirt was soft against my cheek, and the heat radiating from his body was the only thing keeping the chill of the night at bay. I did not feel the manic rush of adrenaline anymore. I did not feel the urge to laugh, or to scream, or to gloat. The satisfaction of seeing my family in the mud had faded, leaving behind something much deeper and much heavier. It was relief. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes after you have been holding a heavy stone over your head for 20 years, and you finally drop it. Sebastian shifted slightly, wrapping his arm tighter around me, pulling me into the sanctuary of his chest. He didn't speak for a long time. He just let me watch the lights, letting me process the fact that I was never going back to that life. He knew exactly what was going through my mind, because he had read the file. He knew about the missed birthdays. He knew about the rent I paid to live in my own childhood bedroom. He knew about the cold leftovers they let me eat after their dinner parties were over. After a few minutes, his voice came through the headset clear and intimate, as if he were whispering directly into my brain. "I have a question for you, Mrs. Knight." I kept my eyes on the horizon, watching the distant glow of Manhattan approaching like a beacon. "Ask me anything," I replied softly. Sebastian paused, his hand tracing a soothing pattern on my arm. "The bank is going to auction off your parents' house within the month. It is prime real estate. The land value alone is significant. But the house itself holds history." He turned his head to look at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "Do you want it? I can make a call right now. I can buy the note from the bank before it even hits the market. We can renovate it. You can burn the furniture. You can paint over the walls. You can turn it into a summer home or a storage unit. It can be yours, Audrey. You can own the roof they made you pay to sleep under." I closed my eyes, visualizing the house. It was a sprawling colonial mansion with white pillars and a manicured lawn. To the outside world, it looked like the American dream, but to me, it was a prison. I remembered the cold draft in the guest room where they moved me so Brittany could have the master suite. I remembered the kitchen where I washed dishes while they drank wine in the living room. I remembered the hallway where my stepmother told me I would never amount to anything. Possessing it wouldn't fix the memories. Owning the bricks and mortar wouldn't erase the ghosts. If I bought it even just to leave it empty, I would still be tied to them. I would still be the daughter trying to prove something. I would still be playing their game just from a position of power. And I was done playing. I opened my eyes and looked at the city lights burning bright and clean in the distance. "No," I said, my voice firm and final. "I don't want it. I don't want the deed. I don't want the keys. I don't even want the land if it means keeping that structure standing." Sebastian waited, knowing there was more. "Buy it." I continued, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "Buy it as soon as the bank opens tomorrow morning. Don't even negotiate. Just take it." "And then what?" Sebastian asked, intrigued. "Bulldoze it," I said. "Level it to the ground. Crush every brick, every pillar, every piece of expensive molding, until there is nothing left but dirt. And then I want you to donate the land to the city." I sat up slightly, looking him in the eye. "Build a park, Sebastian. A public park. Put in a swing set where my father's study used to be. Put a picnic table right over the spot where my stepmother used to scream at me. Plant wildflowers where Brittany parked her car. Make it a place where anyone can go. A place where children can play for free. A place where no one is excluded." I took a deep breath, feeling the last knot of tension in my chest loosen. I want to erase the legacy of the Knight family and replace it with laughter. I want the only thing remaining of Richard and Patricia to be a plaque on a bench that says "Donated by the Knight Foundation." I want them to drive past it in their used car 10 years from now and see happy families having picnics on the ground they thought was too good for the rest of the world. That is how I want to win, by turning their fortress of exclusion into a playground. Sebastian looked at me for a long moment. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It wasn't the shark smile he used in business. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. He leaned forward and kissed my forehead, a gesture of reverence. "Done," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will have the demolition crew there by Monday. It will be the most beautiful park in Newport." He keyed the microphone to speak to the pilot. "ETA, to the penthouse captain." "10 minutes, sir," the pilot replied. Sebastian settled back, pulling me with him. "10 minutes," he whispered to me. "Then we are home. Real home." I closed my eyes again, listening to the hum of the engine. I imagined the wrecking ball smashing through the front door of my childhood home. I imagined the walls crumbling, and in the dust of that destruction I saw my future rising. I was not angry anymore. I was not sad. I was free. And for the first time in my life, the silence in my head was beautiful. The city of New York rose up to meet us like a galaxy of glass and steel, a million lights burning against the velvet darkness of the night. From this altitude, the noise of the world below was non-existent. There was no shouting, no sirens, no desperate pleas for money. There was only the steady rhythmic hum of the rotor blades and the quiet breathing of the man sleeping beside me. Sebastian had drifted off, his hands still firmly interlocking with mine, an anchor in the sky. I looked at my reflection in the thick-tinted window of the helicopter. For years, when I looked in a mirror, I saw a girl who was broken. I saw a girl who was always apologizing for taking up space. I saw the poor relation who wore second-hand clothes and hid in the library to avoid the sneers of her own sister. I saw a victim. But tonight, staring back at me from the glass, was a woman I was just beginning to know. She was not broken. She was forged. I thought about the people I had left behind in the mud of Newport. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal. They were probably still standing there, shivering in the cold ocean wind, arguing over who was to blame for their downfall. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, bound by debts they could not pay and lies they could no longer sustain. They had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel small so they could feel big. They had mocked my silence. They had ridiculed my independence. They had treated my solitude as a disease to be cured. They laughed at me because I walked alone. They mocked me because I did not need their parties or their approval to feel whole. They thought that being alone meant being weak. But they forgot the most important lesson of all. They forgot that the person who walks alone is the only one light enough to fly. You cannot soar when you are weighed down by the expectations of people who do not love you. You cannot reach the clouds when you are holding on to anchors made of greed and vanity. I looked down at the sprawling metropolis beneath us. Somewhere down there, life was messy and loud. But up here, everything was clear. People always say that revenge is a dish best served cold. They tell you to crush your enemies to make them suffer, to take an eye for an eye. But looking at the peace on Sebastian's face and feeling the freedom in my own chest, I realized how wrong they were. True revenge is not about destruction. It is not about screaming or fighting or clawing your way through the mud to bring them down to your level. That only makes you dirty. The best revenge is simply taking off. It is removing yourself from the equation entirely. It is letting them watch you rise until you are nothing but a speck of light in their dark sky. It is letting them see you happy, truly, deeply, untouchably happy in a place they can never touch, and a height they can never reach. The pilot banked the helicopter gently to the right, aligning us with the shimmering spire of the Empire State Building. The future lay ahead, bright and limitless. I did not look back at the dark coastline. I did not check my phone. The past was a closed book, rotting in a landfill. The future was an open sky. And finally, for the first time in my life, I was flying. The story of Audrey and the Knight family serves as a brutal yet beautiful reminder that true power never needs to announce itself. Richard, Patricia, and Brittany spent their entire lives chasing the illusion of wealth, prioritizing the label on a bottle of wine over the content of their character. They believed that worth was measured by what you could display to the world, failing to realize that the loudest people in the room are often the emptiest. They treated Audrey with contempt because her quiet dignity threatened their fragile egos. They mistook her silence for weakness and her humility for failure, a mistake that ultimately cost them everything. This narrative teaches us that integrity is the only currency that does not devalue over time. While Jamal built a castle on a foundation of lies and debt, Audrey built a life on truth and resilience. The family's downfall was not just financial, it was moral. They burned the only bridge that could have saved them because they were too proud to walk across it with respect. It illustrates that you should never look down on anyone unless you are helping them up, because the person you mock today might be the only one holding the keys to your survival tomorrow. Ultimately, the best revenge against those who belittle you is not to fight them in the mud, but to ascend to a level where their insults can no longer reach you. Success is the best silencer. If you enjoyed watching justice served cold and want to hear more stories about underdogs rising to the top, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for your daily dose of karma.